You're listening to St. PeteX Season 2. Today's episode is brought to you by CapEx Advisory Group. When organizations undertake large capital or real estate projects, they turn to CapEx for additional resources and expertise. To learn what an owner's rep can do for you, visit CapEx's website at ceag2.com. That's CEAG2.com. And by the Open Partnership Education Network located at the University of South Florida in St. Petersburg. The world is open for citizens, businesses, groups, for all of us to become a smarter, better connected city by learning together. To find out more about Open, including upcoming great Aresti speakers, please visit learnopen.org. Now enjoy the conversation. Joining me on SPX is Iqbal Paroo. Welcome, sir.
Thank you for having me.
You have a very interesting life, and I'm excited to dig into it. I guess what you would consider your sort of core profession is a boutique consulting effort in the medicine space. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. So I actually call it in the healthcare space, which would include medicine. And it comes out of a very long career that I've had in healthcare from my early days. In fact, from my days in the undergraduate, when I was an undergraduate, I worked in a nursing home just to supplement income while I was on a scholarship. And there's a whole story behind how I got into healthcare, because I was born and raised in Kenya and was in Kenya Air Force training as a pilot. And one weekend I had an accident and lost my leg, above the knee, my left leg, and was amputated. And while I was recovering, I began to think about, I knew I wasn't going to be able to fly again. So I said, what am I going to do? And was just intrigued with my own recovery process and the healthcare being practiced around me. But you got to remember, it was 1967 in Kenya, so the medicine was pretty basic. And yet it saved my life, and an epiphany came to me, which was to sort of think about healthcare medicine as a space I could pursue. And I was a very strong student, and the sciences, I was very strong in it. I also grew up in a family where I was exposed to a lot of business, so I had a business sense to me. So I said, wow, I could combine all of this and potentially pursue healthcare. And that's what ended up bringing me to the U.S. I got a scholarship through USAID to come to the U.S., and that took me on a long path. I was the youngest administrator of a hospital in our company. I was only 25, and I became administrator of a hospital. And by 37, I was president of Harvard University in Philadelphia, which is a health sciences university. And in between, I'd done many, many things in running larger hospitals, helped build a campus in Karachi, Pakistan for the Aga Khan Foundation. I had run and done a turnaround of Meharry Medical College in Nashville. So I was deeply, deeply steeped in the healthcare space. And then I've done many other things in my career, but finally, 10 years ago, I decided to stop being a chief executive of a large organization, whatever it was, because I had also run a foundation for a few years. I set up a boutique consulting practice, and so that's what I do now.
Well, there's a lot in there. Let's go back to Kenya.
Yes.
So, and you had the accident when you were, what age?
I was 17.
Can you talk about the accidents? And
Yeah. So I was on a motorcycle with friends on a weekend, because as I said, I was in flight training at the Air Force, and I had the weekend off. So I was on a motorcycle and was hit by a car, being driven by an elderly lady who was coming out of her driveway. And she failed to stop. She just entered the main road, which I was on. And so were my friends. And she hit me. I think from what I understand, she panicked. And when she hit me, she, instead of putting on the brakes, she hit the accelerator, which dragged me for quite a distance. And in the process, crushed my left leg. So I ended up in an emergency room where they determined that the damage was so severe. They tried to save the leg. But, when you sever your popliteal and femoral artery, you're bleeding out, there's not much they can do. But they tried. They tried very hard to save it. The truth is that even in 1967 in the United States, you couldn't have saved the leg because we didn't have microvascular surgery and didn't know how to actually do the kind of work that it needed to save that leg. So yeah, that's what happened.
Obviously that's a very impactful event, and you have this impactful event and you have all of a sudden the realization that flying is going to be off the table at that point. And you have this long recovery period of which you have a lot of time to think. So it's a very open-minded age. It's a very large event. Tell me about the epiphany process.
Yeah. So as I was recovering, in the early part of my recovery, because I was injured so severely, I have vague memories except a lot of pain and the realization that I'd been amputated, because I remember waking up post-surgery and realizing the leg was gone. But 2-3 weeks into the recovery, I started thinking about, so now what am I going to do?
Mm-hmm.
And there was a fascination around what was happening around me, how my care was being delivered. And the first question I had was, how does this place run?
Right.
And through that, I realized there was a person, they called him the hospital superintendent. But today we call them hospital administrators, hospital presidents, but he was British. And they said, he's the person who runs this place. And I actually said, could I meet that person? I was just curious. And they were very nice. They must have gone and asked him that we have a patient upstairs who's asking to meet you and learn.
Mm-hmm.
And so he invited me. So I was on my crutches and went to his office and sat down with him. I even remember his name. His last name was McBride.
Mm.
He was very kind. He talked to me about what his job was to run the place. And I took it to heart and I said, this is really interesting. So after my discharge, I talked to my father and said, I'd really like to study this thing. And it was McBride, actually, who was British, who said to me, I was trained in the National Health Service in Britain,
Mm-hmm.
but America has a different health system. And I think that you may want to consider the option, because Kenya was a British colony when I was growing up, and then it became independent when I was 13 years old. So we had an orientation to Britain. So a lot of my classmates went to England to go to school. But he said to me, you might want to think about America. It's an emerging field.
Right.
It's a new field in America itself in those days. And so that led me to go down to the American embassy and engage him in a discussion about it.
Interesting. So when you went to meet the superintendent
Yes.
at the hospital, did you feel like that was just more curiosity driven or more driven by, wanting to make things better because of what happened to you?
Yes.
You see a lot of people, some of the biggest champions in certain spaces, breast cancer, someone who survived breast cancer, childhood disease, someone who's lost someone of that childhood disease, and that gives them the impetus then to pursue that as a passion and profession. When you went down this road, how much of it do you think was that sort of side of it because of what you had been through, or just, really true general curiosity and interest?
That's an interesting question. And I have noodled about that because others have asked me that, given that my long career in healthcare, they all want to know, how'd you get into it? Especially if you were, born and raised in Kenya, and what brought you to America. So the way I think about it, and as you know how the brain works, you sort of, there's a little bit of revisionist in that you think you were thinking that.
Right.
So I try really hard to actually go back and examine the journey I was on. So whenever I get asked what you just asked me, I've now been pretty consistent about how I answer that because I have thought about it, which is that clearly the initial part of it was truly curiosity. It was like, whoa, how does this thing work?
Mm-hmm.
There's so many different people doing so many different things. How is my care being delivered? So there was definitely this sort of curiosity. It is only after I had a conversation with him that curiosity very quickly turned into, I think this would be interesting for me to pursue. And the other thing that at the same time I was thinking about was, I'm a Kenyan. And if I went and got trained in this, I could come back and run one of these hospitals over time. After I've gotten not only my education, but some experience, I could do this. And this whole idea that as a newly independent country, we have to rely on an expatriate, on somebody else to manage something that is so vital, so essential to the country. And so it was really a bunch of things that crossed my mind. Curiosity converting to, wow, I could do this, to saying, I should do this because then I can come back and do this. That's what led me to it.
But that's a lot of confidence and vision for a 17-year-old. And that's what I wonder. You say, let me talk to the person who runs this place. And, I wonder if it's, if the energy is, I can make it better. And so when you were there, was the mindset that this is something that is slightly broken that I can make better, or this is something that's working that we can innovate on?
No, I didn't know enough to make an assessment. That'd be pretty arrogant of me to figure out that it's not working well. Definitely, it wasn't something that I said, oh, it's not really working well. I could do better. I had no idea even how it worked.
Right. So you were looking up at it at that point.
Yeah, it was like, whoa. Today I use that word. I can assure you I didn't have that word in my vocabulary in 1967, which is the sense of self-organization. Like, how does this place know, given how many people are in various beds, what they need, when they need it, how they need it, how much they need, from who? A nurse or a technician? Or how does it all work? It was so intriguing to me. And then again, the other word that I use today, which is, again, not something I thought about, was this sense of interdependency, that not only is it self-organized, but there is an interdependency between professionals, that they trust each other of doing the right job at the right time, at the right place, that they're doing something that's working. And those were thoughts, but not refined enough for me to say that I understood the sense of self-organization, trust, interdependency, all of those things. Only as I began to study it, very quickly I reflected on my thoughts and said, whoa, this is what it really is.
Well, and a lot of those words you described could also be used to describe the military, working together, independence, trust, everybody playing their part, how's it all organized. So given that you were starting to walk down that path, definitely some parallels there.
You are right. When I was being trained as a pilot, I thought about all the people I relied on, no question. In fact, we were actually explicitly taught we were relying on the mechanics that checked the aircraft before we got into it. We were relying on the control tower. We were relying on the people who were thinking about the weather, who were giving us the reports. We were relying on the flight engineer. In those days, you'd have somebody sitting next to you as a flight engineer or a navigator, and relying on the set of instruments in front of me and realizing that if these don't work, I'm in trouble.
Yeah.
But somebody obviously is maintaining them, checking them, they're testing them. And so, yes, that much I learned in my flight training.
All right. So then you initially went to school what was the program?
In Atlanta. So I went to Georgia State University, who gave me the scholarship through USAID. And I enrolled in the business school.
Okay.
And took as my major finance, primarily because I'd grown up in a business family and that I knew that the things that I wanted to study were more at the graduate level.
Right.
So I needed a foundation. But besides studying finance, which I'd already done a lot of sciences, because I went to the British school system. So it's what we call O levels and A levels. A levels is like pre-university. So I'd done a lot of physics and chemistry and biology and math, and I'd done all of that. But I wanted to make sure at the university level I took those courses because there was a side of me that said, I might pursue medicine. I might go become a doctor. And so I was doing both. I was taking a lot of sciences and I was studying finance. So I was keeping all my options open as an undergrad.
Got it. And before we leave Kenya, what was the family business that you grew up in?
So we had several businesses. My family is of Indian, Persian origin, but we've lived in Africa for over 150 years. So family was originally from the island of Zanzibar. That's where my father was born, my grandfather, my great-grandfather, they were all born on the island. So I was the first one born in Kenya, in the capital city of Nairobi, which was, when I was born, it was a tiny town, more like a railway stop. Today, it's a metropolis of 7 million people. When I was born, there were, 50, 70,000 people. By the time I left in 1968, it had grown to 350,000. As I said, today it's 7 million. So, in our family, my great-grandfather and grandfather were all traders. So there were spice merchants and they traded between Asia and Africa. My father then branched off and moved to the capital city and had a couple of small businesses there in electronics. He had the RCA franchise, and my uncle had the Coca-Cola bottling plant.
Oh, wow.
So I was exposed to, interestingly, from the time I was young, even though it was a British colony, I was exposed to America.
Mm.
I learned very young about Elvis Presley and John Wayne, and all the American icons. I learned about all of that very young.
Interesting. All right. So you left university and moved straight into administration.
While I was in school, I lost my father the year I was here in school. So, I was young and he was very young. He was 46 when he passed away. And so my immediate reaction was to go back home. But my mom insisted. I had 3 younger sisters and she insisted I stay in America. And she said, that's what your father would have wanted. You need to finish school. You can't come back home and go into the business.
Right.
And I then took a job, initially part-time and then full-time, in a nursing home to supplement some income. By the time I was a junior, I was offered a job in a hospital to run the entire business operations. And by the time I became a senior in my undergraduate school, they'd already given me enough responsibilities in the clinical departments besides the business office. So I was learning the business fast. And through that process, I decided instead of going into medicine, I'd pursue healthcare management. So I then enrolled in the MBA program while I was still working and got a master's in healthcare administration at the university. And then spent a year in residency, which was a requirement to ultimately get your professional degree. So that's how I got into the field. And literally, the moment I finished my graduate work, the company where I was already working in the hospital asked me, he said, you're ready, you've been working. We want to send you to one of our newer hospitals in Biloxi, Mississippi, to open it and become its first administrator. So I was 25 and I went to run the hospital.
And that leads me back to, how does a junior get that amount of responsibility?
Yeah.
What was the relationship, or how did that job open up to you?
Because the hospital was owned by Charter Medical Corporation, and the hospital that I was working in Atlanta, which was Shellerford Community Hospital, was owned by Charter Medical.
But I mean, even the first position where you got when you were a junior.
Oh, yeah. When I got the business.
Because that's a pretty advanced position for a junior, right?
So when that hospital was advertising for somebody to come run it was a new hospital. They wanted to run business operations. I applied for the job and I told them that I'd been doing all this for the past several years at the nursing home, that I understood healthcare. And they brought me in for an interview, and there were obviously many other candidates. And the person who was the controller of the hospital and also the vice president, so he was number 2, interviewed me initially because I was going to run the business operations, which would include, the front office and admissions and patient billing and insurance and accounting. And I'd done many of those courses, in school. Plus, as I said, I grew up in a business family, so I had a neck for business. And he interviewed me, and then he said, we'll call you back. And within a few days, he called me and said, the administrator wants to meet you. So I think he went to the administrator and said, I got this guy who's foreign born, but he really understands this business. I want to hire him. And the administrator said, I got to meet this person before you hand him the job. So he met me, and at the end of the interview, he said, I now understand why Elliot, who was the controller, wanted to hire you. So I went to work for them. And literally over the 2 years, from my junior to senior year, the 2 years, they kept on giving me added responsibilities, and I kept on absorbing them. And by the end of my senior year, as I said, I was running clinical departments plus the business office.
And at that age, how did you manage the relationships with the doctors so that they didn't walk all over you?
One of the things that if you talk to doctors from my first hospital that I ran all the way to the last hospital that I was the chief executive of, that whole entire journey over 30 years. And even when I was president of the university, I still had to deal with doctors. The one thing they will all tell you was that one of the best skills that I had was learning how to understand doctors, how to work with them, how to be deliberate about finding ways to meet their needs, but not at the expense of patients. I always put patients in the middle. And I always figured out that I'm willing to create the enabling environment, the right conditions for doctors to be more successful, to work better, to deliver the quality care, as long as their primary objective was the patient and not the money. And I was very tough about that.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean that they didn't make good money, but it had to be because the center of what we designed as I thought about care was the patient and the quality of the care.
And with your style, did you make it a matter of building the infrastructure to operate that way? Or did you put that out there as a, sort of, this is my leadership style? Because at that, I guess, I almost have to make an infrastructure at that age, especially.
I grew up, as I said, very fast. One, because I grew up in a business family. Two, I was the only son, 3 sisters, and a dozen cousins who were all girls. And so I learned really fast as a young man to be given responsibilities. And then my father passed away. And as I said, I realized that I was the patriarch of the family. And just as a sidebar, I was still a sophomore in school at that time. And my youngest sister by then was 13. When my dad passed away, she was only 11. And my older sisters, who were just a year and 2 years younger than me, by then had gone to Canada to go to school. And my mother called me one day and said, I can't handle your sister. She's 13. She's a teenager. It's tough on me. She needs a dad.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm sending her to you. So my sister came to live with me. That's when I moved out of the dorms and moved into an apartment. And I basically put her through school while I was also in school and working. And I put her through high school in the United States. And so I assumed a lot of responsibility at a young age. And I think between how I grew up and the responsibilities I took on, all, I think, led me to develop certain skill sets about dealing with things and people and issues. And so assuming responsibility at a young age was something I just learned.
Right.
So when I was given these jobs, I think, as I said, at the age of 37, I was the youngest president of the university in the history of that university, 150-year-old history. I was the first person at the age of 37 to become president of the university, taking on a lot of responsibility.
When you moved on to run the hospital in, did you say it was
Biloxi, the first one, yeah. And then I did several after that.
And that was all within the same
company.
Yes. And just kept moving to bigger hospitals,
yes.
essentially.
And then they moved me to New Orleans. And then they moved me to their biggest hospital, which was Las Vegas.
Mm-hmm.
So I went to run that hospital. It was at that time that I was called by the Aga Khan Foundation out of Geneva, who was building a campus in Karachi, brand new campus, and wanted to establish that campus at a North American standard. So they were building a 800-bed teaching hospital, a medical school, a nursing school as phase one. And then since then, they've built many more schools. And they wanted somebody who had grown up in a developing country,
mm-hmm.
who was educated in the U.S., who would be the bridge, because at that time, Pakistan was substantially considered underdeveloped to developing.
Right.
And to think of bringing a standard of care at a much higher level and a standard of education, they needed somebody who actually understood the environment, the culture, and the delta, the gap between what they had and where the aspiration was. And so I was asked to be the head of the project. So I went to Karachi for 3 years to help get that campus off the ground.
What was that decision process like? Obviously, you'd been with
one
company.
Career.
Yeah.
So I left that, and the company was initially surprised because I was so successful at a very young age.
Right.
And they knew that I would continue growing within the company and assume bigger leadership roles. But they were also very supportive of the fact that there was a calling. There was a calling for me to go back. So I hadn't gone back to Kenya,
right,
but I was ready to go back to a developing country to deploy the skills and the experiences I had gained to go build something that would benefit that part of the world for a long time to come. So they actually were very supportive and understood that and said, when you return to the U.S., there'll always be a home here for you.
Right. So, there's a uniqueness to how fast you had to grow up. You had a number of facets, both from the trauma to your father, to, the gender mix in your family that had you sort of skip a few levels of personal evolution, right?
Yes,
Because you
yes.
could. And if you take that and look at a normal life's arc, there's sort of the coming up years, the learning, the finding your way, and then working towards success, and then kind of redefining your meaning, which is when a lot of people start to give back and change their life in that way. Do you feel like when you decided to leave to go to Karachi that it was more that you had accelerated through the professional and you were sort of, okay, I've been there, done that, and my meanings are changing? Or do you feel like it was, I've always knew I wanted to go back since I was a child, and this is just an exercise of that?
Yeah, it was that. There was still a lot of growing up for me to do, a lot of more learning to do. And I sort of knew that, In hindsight, at this stage in my life, after 45 years in healthcare, and I'm almost 70 now, I look back and I thought, what were they thinking when they made me the head of a hospital at 25?
Right.
Even though I was successful.
Yep.
But boy, what risk they were taking, because I could have really screwed up.
How was your confidence at that? When they offered you the job, when they said, come to Karachi, did you have any confidence lacks or you felt good?
No, I felt very good. Because I'd already had a successful career at a young age, I was quite confident that I could do this. But the reason for going was the calling.
Mm-hmm.
It was going to be an opportunity. Even though I was young, I thought, wow, this is an opportunity to contribute.
Right.
It wasn't about giving back. It was more like contributing to potentially something long-term that could have an impact. And it now, it's 30 years later, it's having an enormous impact in that part of the world. And I did that a couple of more times. I've gone back out of the country, and I went to Malaysia for 5 years in my mid-40s.
Right.
After I left the university, I was venture funded and built a whole healthcare company in Malaysia for 5 years.
If I were to have asked you, I guess, obviously since you did it, you got the meaning out of it. But if you say you had the calling when you left Karachi, mission accomplished and feeling good, or?
Feeling very good, came back. I probably came back sooner than I would have come back. I might have stayed longer. But by then, the political situation in the country had deteriorated. The prime minister at that time was Zulfikar Bhutto. His daughter later on, Benazir Bhutto, became the prime minister. Zulfikar Bhutto, the father, was prime minister, and there was a coup by General Zia, and he was overthrown. And by that time, I was married and had a child, and I was concerned. I was married to a girl from the U.S. who I'd met actually in Switzerland when I was there for a meeting. And I decided that I think for a whole host of reasons, it was time to come back. And so I came back and sort of re-entered the U.S. healthcare space and immediately became a chief executive and went to Nashville. And by then, I went to didn't go back to my old company because they had already restructured and been acquired. So I went to Hospital Corporation of America and went to run Hubbard Hospital of Meharry Medical College, which was the historically Black medical school in the United States, which was at that time in distress, financially in trouble. And so I went to do a turnaround.
So use the term CEO instead of hospital administrator. Why?
I think the field had evolved by then, and so they were using different titles. So they would use executive director of a hospital rather than administrator. Then the title evolved to president and chief executive. Yeah, so it was just an evolution. In some ways, the healthcare field was becoming such a huge business. I mean, the last enterprise I ran was, $6 billion business. So it was so huge that when they thought about the people running it and the skills required, they thought about paralleling that with corporate America. It's the same kind of people you would need, except the different set of skill sets.
And what attracted you to a turnaround, and how was that process?
So when I was asked to do that, the turnaround was primarily because the institution had lost a lot of federal funding, and it was in a depressed part of Nashville, historically Black school, serving a lot of underserved people, underinsured. And I think the company realized that, one, I had skills around being very good at the business side of it, but also it needed somebody who would have compassion for what they were going through.
Right.
And so they realized, somebody who's been overseas, worked in difficult environments, has grown up in another country. And, in hindsight, I think they picked me because they realized that somebody who would be viewed by that community, which is predominantly African American,
Right.
and that I was born in Africa, even though I'm not African American, and understood what it meant to be a minority in a British colony.
Right.
And so they wanted somebody who could do the business side of it, but also have the sensitivity to the culture of what the people were going through.
How much were you impacted by race when you came to the States and obviously in Britain as well? And then how did that sort of evolve into how you handle that aspect of the turnaround? Because obviously as the head of that organization, you are the main ambassador out to the community,
Absolutely.
which means you're addressing those issues with the community.
So your question has two dimensions
It does.
to it. One was growing up in a British colony where I was in the minority, and so were 99% of the people. And so you are in a country which is being ruled by white British, predominantly black, with some people of Asian/Indian background. So browns and blacks, the traditional apartheid issues of South Africa versus white control. And it was in 1963 when I was 13 that finally Kenya became independent. So I recall my first 13 years growing up in that country where, if you were not white, you were not allowed in certain places. You couldn't, go to certain clubs. You couldn't go to certain restaurants. You couldn't go to public facilities. You weren't allowed. There were swimming pools, which were for whites only, Though I was fortunate enough to be able to go to a swimming pool in my school, which was multiracial, so it didn't matter. But millions of other people were not able to. And so I grew up seeing that. As you can imagine how it would make one feel when you go through something like that. Then after independence, obviously things changed. Then I come to the US and I go to the South. And I remember growing up in Kenya, admiring John Kennedy and Martin Luther King. And then obviously the assassinations of somebody who I admired. And I'm a young man. And then subsequently the assassination of Martin Luther King. And also I was exposed to the Peace Corps, which came from America to all these countries. And so I met a lot of Peace Corps workers.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, wow, these people are good people. They don't treat you as inferior. And then when I come to America, and I'm in Atlanta, Georgia, the home of Martin Luther, and I realize the racial divide. And I see it in school. I see it in housing. I saw it everywhere. Now, I was not black. I was not white. Interestingly, I was a novelty because people were quite intrigued to see somebody who was born in Africa of Asian background with a British accent. This is what I had 45 years ago. And they were intrigued by that. So in some ways, it was sort of weird. I was like a novelty for a while. But I absolutely experienced the racial tension growing up. And then the one thing I quickly learned, which I also learned in Africa, that people can take a lot away from you, but they can't take away your brain. If you are good at something, at some point you'll be recognized.
Mm-hmm.
And so I excelled in school. I excelled at my work. And very soon I realized that people who engage with me saw beyond my color. They just saw me, not my color. And on top of that, as I said earlier, I was quite self-confident as a young man. So I never thought about it. But I have experienced overt, explicit racial discrimination as a young man in this country. I experienced it in Alabama. I have experienced it as a young man in restaurants, in shopping centers. When I was in my early 20s, I experienced all of that.
But when you took over the job in Nashville,
Yes.
now it becomes more
profound.
more
Yes.
than you, because
Yes.
now you have to
Yes, because the school was
you have a
historically black.
constituency. Yeah.
And so part of my task that I gave myself was to actually, as I say, walk in the shoes of the fishermen, understand where they were coming from rather than them understanding who I was.
Mm-hmm.
And just because I grew up in Africa doesn't mean I automatically knew and understood the African American culture. I just didn't. And so I immersed in that. And, I learned about the history, the challenges they'd experienced, the discrimination, the disproportionate funding.
Mm-hmm.
That when funding came, how the city of Nashville conveniently spent more of their resources on the other side of the tracks than this side of the tracks, whether it was in housing, in healthcare, in any public service. You could just see it. The roads were better on one side or the other one. Street lighting was better here than there. And so it was obvious to me, and this was not just Nashville, right? It was in every city in America, especially in the South, this happened. So I really made it my objective to understand, learn, engage, immerse. And so I met local African-American leaders. I went to their churches. I participated in social events. Even though my wife was white and my children were biracial, I made it a special effort to do all of that. And through that, I think there was a sense of acceptance of who I was.
Right.
They saw through me not my color, but my commitment
Right.
of what I was trying to do.
Then you've gotten to a good resting place there with the students and the board and that sort of community.
Yes.
But you still are a high functioning sort of outsider with a unique inroads into it. And then you have to take that confidence and acumen and now new understanding of what the plight is of that, and then represent that back to the people with the money.
Yes.
So how do you handle that?
Sure. So you went to the heart of what I had to do, which is President Reagan had just come into office, and the Secretary of HHS was Schweiker from Pennsylvania. And we were notified, we meaning the institution,
Mm-hmm.
that they were going to cut off what they call distress funding.
Mm-hmm.
And we were in default of the tax-exempt bonds that had been floated to build the hospital. And the other funding came to the medical schools, to Meharry Medical College. And they were going to cut it off. And I went down to Washington and met with the staff of HHS and basically said to them, and at least this is what I was told, that President Reagan had decided we're going to stop this distress funding. We're not going to give them any more money. So I basically said to them, to the staff, does the president and the secretary have the context of supposedly this decision to shut off the funding? That this is a historically Black medical school. It's been around 100 and some years. That 50% of the Black doctors and dentists practicing in the United States, primarily in underserved areas, right? They're not practicing on Fifth Avenue in New York. They're practicing in poor communities. Came from this school. This one, Howard in Washington. Obviously, there was Tuskegee in Alabama. It wasn't a medical school.
Right.
But these are the schools that have created the human capital to serve citizens of this country who happen to be Black.
Right.
And they're going to shut off the funding. So not only you're shutting off the human capital they're providing, but the historical value of this and what it means in our own history and the backlash that might come from all of that. I mean, has anybody thought through all of this?
Not to mention that when the doctors leave those distressed areas, that's only going to make the burden on the government.
And let's just be honest, a lot of those poor areas of America, primarily which were African American, at that time, there wasn't a very big Hispanic population, in America. It's grown in the last, 40 years or so, but it wasn't that big. Or if it was concentrated in a few areas in the country, Texas and Arizona and New Mexico. But now it's all over. You didn't see any white doctors practicing in those areas. And I'm not knocking them. It's because they were serving in other areas. But there was a real need for people from the community being trained to go back and work in the community. And so I basically said to them, you got to put me in front of the right people so that they don't make what I call a stupid decision. So I'm not coming here to beg for money.
Right.
I'm telling you, you're going to create a human capital problem and you're going to create a serious backlash from a lot of groups all over the country because you're shutting down the historical school. And whatever process they went through internally, we got notified that the decision had been pulled back. So we continue to get funding.
That's great. Then how long did you stay in that role?
So I was there just under 2 years because it was a primary turnaround kind of a job. And then the idea was to recruit potentially, if we could find, which we did, an African-American executive to succeed me because I thought it was the right thing for that community to be served by one of its own, which we did and found an outstanding person to come into that role. And then I moved on and moved to Miami for a few years to run a health system there. Then from there, went to California for a short time to launch the international division of the healthcare company. We were going to work in the Pacific. So I was living out of there and working in the Pacific. And it was during that time that I was recruited to come to Philadelphia to become the chief executive of the healthcare system for the university. And then 2 years later, I became president of the university. And that was a big transition for me because I left, running healthcare and systems into academics and going to higher education. And I was honored that I was recruited, and it was sort of a big step in my life to move into that career. And I did that for 7 years.
Which university?
Hardeman University
Okay.
in Philadelphia. Then I decided at that point to step out of academic life actually I took a sabbatical, which was not uncommon after 7 years. And I studied healthcare systems in Eastern Europe, which were emerging from communism after the collapse of Soviet Union, and Southeast Asia, which were referred to in those days as tiger states, Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand. So I went to study their healthcare systems for 6 months. And during that time, I decided that this was an opportunity for me to be an entrepreneur and leave academic life and take all my years of experiences and launch a healthcare company. And I selected the market to be Southeast Asia over Eastern Europe, and went to Warburg Pincus, large equity fund in New York, and raised capital with them, and launched the company, and spent 5 years building the healthcare company in Asia, which I ultimately sold.
So the raising capital piece of that, was that a connection that you had, or did you go to multiple places and end up there, or what was that pitch process like?
The connection was that during my sabbatical in Asia, the head of Warburg Pincus in Asia was based in Hong Kong, and I met him at a meeting in India.
Mm-hmm.
He was there assessing a project in India to invest in, and I happened to be at that time in India, asked by Apollo Hospital, the company he was looking at, the president of that company, to give him some advice. So I was on the other side assessing the opportunity. His name was Chip Kay, who is now president of Warburg. But at that time, he was head of Asia. He met me and we struck up a conversation. And he said to me, if you want to launch a company in Asia, why don't we fund you?
That's easy.
He said to me, why don't you come to New York? I'm coming to New York and meet the president of the health group.
Right.
His name was Rod Moorhead. He said, come meet him and let's have a conversation. And one thing led to another, and we came to an agreement that I would go launch a company in Asia and base it in Kuala Lumpur, and they funded me.
And what was the
the company? I built up the company, started as aggregating primary care initially, and at the same time using the leverage of the primary care aggregation to establish ambulatory centers, surgical centers, and then build 2 hospitals, which would be the feeder from our primary care network. But the key thing was to bring systems and processes that would create efficiency and effectiveness and high quality in the delivery of care, and at the same time accessing the intellectual capital, kind of training and education that was available to upgrade the staff and then take them back. So on both the business side and healthcare delivery side, we participated in training business staff, and then we trained doctors, we trained nurses who have been trained in the country, and then we gave them additional training at a higher standard and took them back. That created sort of privately financed to serve the emerging middle class, the kind of care that they were seeking. So that's what I did. And we built that company. And then I left and the company continued. I sold my interest in the company. And that company ultimately, 3-4 years after I had left, went public. It's called Qualitas. It's trading on the KL Stock Exchange. Very successful.
And is at this point that you started the consulting business?
So no, then I came back to the US and was doing some consulting on my own at that time, but really testing what I wanted to do next, because I knew I was being approached by headhunters to go become president, CEO of healthcare systems. And I thought, I'm not sure I want to get back into doing that. But while I'm thinking through it, and by this time my kids were growing up and a couple of them have gone off to college, and I was just thinking, and I had remarried, and my wife, who was originally from Florida, that's why I'm here now. She brought me back to St. Pete. But we met in Philadelphia, and she was a banker and then became a venture capitalist. In fact, she was a founder of a venture fund in Philly. But I started thinking about what to do next and got a call. And I was advising a few biotech firms on the West Coast who were also venture funded. So the venture company came to me and said, could you sort of be the chair of a couple of companies? They have entrepreneur chief executives, but we want some senior leadership in those companies. So one was in San Francisco, one was in San Diego. And I was commuting, running those companies. And I got a call from the founder of eBay, Piero Midyar, who then recruited me to be the first president of his foundation after he had taken eBay public and created a substantial amount of wealth for himself. And he established the Omidyar Foundation, which ultimately morphed into, while I was there, into Omidyar Network, because now we do philanthropy, we do venture investing, private capital for social good, and some public policy work. So we do all three things. So I became its first president in 2002 and stayed there till 2007 to scale it. And so ran the foundation for 5 years. And when I retired from that, it was then that my wife, Janet, said, she wanted to come back to St. Pete. She had left here when she was 18, so she had been gone 35 some years. But she wanted to come back. Her mother was aging. And so she said, I want to come back and spend some time here. So we decided to come back, not with the idea that we were going to live here long term, just to come back and spend a few years. It's sort of an initial landing pad. And just over time, the city morphed and changed and grew. We fell in love with the city. We loved the people we had met. And here we are, 10 years later, made St. Pete home. And so now it's more than 10, 11. So it came in 2008. And so over those 11 years after I was here, it's when I established my boutique practice. And my first client was Johns Hopkins, then Atlantic Health, then Emory University and Emory Health, and now the Henry Ford Health System in Detroit.
Unrelevant to St. Pete, obviously, Johns Hopkins ended up with its second true Johns Hopkins location here.
Yes.
What role did you play in that?
So I was involved in the initial assessment of that opportunity on behalf of Hopkins. So I was on the Hopkins side. Then when the decision was made, working with the board of All Children's to bring that into Johns Hopkins, I recruited some of the staff from Hopkins and was involved in the first 2 years of what we call integration. So now Hopkins has been here for 7, 8 years, but the first 2 years I was involved in helping integrate what I would call the sort of capacity of Hopkins. It's intellectual, human, social capital, all the things that were there into All Children's and the consolidation of the back office and all. So I spent 2 years doing that as a consultant, helping them. So that was the role that I played in that. And then stayed involved for another year, sort of quarterly meetings in strategy and advising in those days. Yeah. So it was 2013, 14, 15, those 2, 3 years.
You've had a large variety of, almost 3 lifetimes worth in what you've done.
And I haven't talked about my life in Africa. I'm very involved because I was appointed by President Obama to the African Development Foundation, which is a U.S. government agency. Back in 2013, I was appointed. So I've been on it now, going on 6 years on the foundation, where I'm a board member, but I'm also very active. I've led the strategic planning committee. I was the chair of the search committee that brought the new president there. And I'm in Africa 3 to 4 times a year for 2 weeks at a time, working in post-conflict Africa in 18 different countries, doing economic development, social development, working with local communities, empowering women, empowering youth. So I've been involved in the Power Africa project to bring off-grid energy to rural Africa, in the Yali project, which is training young Africans to become leaders. So I spend a good bit of my time now as a volunteer working on the continent.
I'd like to get a little of your wisdom. And with all that experience and all those inputs you've had for all this time, I want to talk first about wealth disparity. So obviously you've seen it from many different angles. So someone mentioned recently that wealth disparity has always been there, that it was always the king or the monarchs or the leaders that had it.
Yes.
But we're certainly digging into it more intellectually now with, as we can see the flow of capital more transparently. What are your thoughts on wealth disparity and its role in?
So I'm very troubled by that. I don't give myself a label, about being a liberal or a socialist or conservative. I don't label myself. I label myself as a humanist. I consider myself a world citizen, literally. I'm U.S. citizen, but I'm a world citizen. I've lived in parts of the world. I've traveled, and I've not only seen it, but I'm troubled by it more and more when I see the kind of distortion it creates in human life, in access to services, and that the debt wealth disparity, especially when you look at the bottom half or 2/3 or 3/4 of America, which is where the disparity is becoming bigger and bigger, the stresses it causes on families, the lack of opportunities, therefore, that they have, forcing young men and women to not pursue their dreams in education because they have no choice but to make a livelihood just to survive. So, from my perspective, the wealth disparity is increasingly contributing to breaking down the long-term value proposition of what America stood for and what its social and human values were, not just here, but all over the world. I'm seeing that being eroded. I'm also troubled by the fact that so many of our policies that I would think that are elected officials who are supposed to represent by the people, for the people, actually represent very small number of people. And the most of the other people seem to be marginalized in the process. And what does surprise me, yes, it troubles me, but surprises me, is how many people continue to vote against their own self-interest, that they're not thinking about the people who they're electing, who are not serving them except during election time to get their votes. All that is troubling.
What's your best explanation for why they do that?
Well, there are probably many things one could think about, right? Which is how much of this comes from being enamored with charismatic people, and therefore you believe in something, or you think that they will do something for you until you realize you have to do it for yourself. Nobody's going to do anything for you. I think the other explanation is that we have lost the kind of transparency. Information gets distorted easily. Talk about what has happened to the field of journalism and news. I'm troubled by the fact that there are many ideological movements emerging in the country. Maybe they've always been here, but I thought, at least in my time in this country, I thought so much of that was finally achieving a level playing field. People were thinking about the difference, but instead, I'm seeing ideology re-emerging, and I think people are latching on to that ideology. And sometimes people are latching on to single causes.
Mm.
So they vote against their self-interest because there is one cause that they are committed to, and they will follow that at the expense of the many other things that they are actually losing out on. So there are many, many of those sort of issues. You and I could have hours of discussion on all of that, but why people do that and what is happening. And I'm, yes, very troubled by that. This country gave me amazing opportunities. I achieved my success in this country. I worked hard for it, but I achieved it here. And he told me that at some point, no matter who you were, what your background was, what your color was, what your faith was, you could achieve. People used to talk about this is the land of opportunity. But I'm seeing so much of that getting eroded. It's very troubling. I'm saddened by it. But I'm fighting it in my own way.
Yes.
Fighting it meaning I'm working hard to level the playing field. I work hard in things that would give people who lack opportunity access to opportunity, to create the enabling conditions and environment for people. I do it in Africa. I'm doing it here too in my own ways. I don't want to leave this conversation without saying that even though a lot of my work has taken me out of the country and out of the region here, but for the past few years, my wife was very active in the community. She has served on many different boards, as more recently the chair of the Florida Orchestra. has been asking me to give more time in the community. So I became involved in the world affairs. I've been involved working with the Open Initiative. I've been meeting with the university officials at USF St. Pete to think about how the community and the university could work together. So I'm starting to devote more time back into the community here, besides nationally and internationally. And I hope to continue doing that.
It's wonderful. Just rough guess, lifetime air miles. How many you got?
How many air miles have I flown?
Millions.
Oh, wow. Yes. I mean, when I had the company in Asia, just during that 4-year period, I flew back and forth to Asia about 47 times, just during that 4-year window.
Wow.
And other flights in between. Yeah. I mean, on the average, I'm on a flight pretty much every week, and 4 or 5 times a month, I'm on a plane somewhere in the US or in the world.
So we end every show with a shout out, someone that you think is doing good work that doesn't get as much attention. That can be an organization. It can be anything you want, essentially, that you just want to shine a little light on.
So I think, I could shout out many organizations internationally who are doing amazing work, which I'm really proud of, and who I've worked with or supported. But I think given that I'm here in St. Pete, sitting with you here, I think it's fair to give a shout out to some local organizations who I think are doing amazing work. Not because my wife is the chair, but I've become more informed about the work of the orchestra. To be honest, when I first got to know the orchestra and my wife was getting involved, I told her, this bunch of elite people go to the orchestra, predominantly white.
Mm-hmm.
And you've been involved in many social things. She was on the foundation. She still is on the board of the Foundation for Healthy St. Pete. She was on the board of the Free Clinic. I said, this is interesting. You want to do this. She said, I'm doing it because I want to enhance the connection of the orchestra to the community.
Mm-hmm.
And then through my engagement with it, I have learned the thousands and tens of hundreds of thousands of people who get exposed to an opportunity through the orchestra, the kids who learn music, the concerts they're doing. So now I've learned they do a lot of community work. So I want to give a shout out to them. I want to give a shout out to the Free Clinic. I think they do fabulous work. I am starting to be more involved in USF St. Pete in any way I can. I think highly of the Chancellor Marty Tadlock, and I think that institution has done a lot for this community, and I think can do more, and I look forward to working with them. And then there are small emerging organizations like yours, your organization, and the Open Initiative. They're still young, and they're looking to have an impact in the community, and I hope to be able to work with them also in whatever I can do to contribute to that. So while you're asking me to give a shout out, I'd say you and your team are doing an amazing job contributing back to the community. Even though you're a business, I know how much work you do pro bono and how you support the community. So thank you for that.
I appreciate that. Thanks. Well, that's a perfect note to end on as far as I'm concerned.
Wonderful. Thanks
Thank you
for
so much.
having
Thanks
me.
for coming in.
Appreciate it.
You've made it to the end of another great episode. For more SPX, visit stpetex.com. Thanks again to our sponsors, CapEx Advisory Group, Build with Confidence. CapEx provides owners representation for the most demanding construction projects. With deep knowledge of design, finance, construction, and public policy, CapEx brings your project to life. CapEx supports your organization with leadership and expertise to reduce cost and ease the burden on your team. Discover what an owner's rep can do for you. Discover CapEx Advisory Group. Visit ceag2.com. That's CEAG2.com. And thanks also again to Open, the Open Partnership Education Network, which puts on great events around St. Petersburg, including Aresti speakers. To see the upcoming calendar of events, visit learnopen.org.